April 1945. A barn in southern Germany. 43 American soldiers locked inside for 120 days. No light, no heat, no hope. Sergeant Tom Riley raised his rifle and blew the padlock off with a single shot. The crack of the round echoed across the frozen farmland like a gunshot at a funeral. He grabbed the heavy doors and ripped them open, and what poured out hit him harder than any bullet ever had. The smell of human waste, of rotting flesh, of 43 men slowly dying in their own filth. Riley turned his head and vomited into the dirt. His soldiers behind him gagged, covered their faces, stumbled backward. Inside that barn, shapes were crawling toward the light. Skeletons with eyes. Men who had not seen the sun since Christmas Eve. And standing 50 meters away, a German farmer named Otto Brandt was watching from the doorway of his warm, well-fed home, his pantry full, his stomach full, his hands clean. He had kept these men locked in his barn for 4 months, and in 2 hours General George S. Patton would arrive. And what Patton ordered next would haunt that farmer until the day he died. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next gripping story. Join us as we uncover more legendary moments, hidden truths, and unforgettable heroes from the darkest chapters of history. This is the story of how one barn, one farmer, and one general delivered a verdict the Geneva Convention never could. To understand what happened in that barn, you have to go back to December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and seize the port of Antwerp. 200,000 German soldiers came roaring out of the freezing fog, smashing into thinly held American lines. The 106th Infantry Division, brand new, untested, freshly arrived in Europe, took the worst of it. Within 48 hours, 2 entire regiments were surrounded near Schnee-Eifel. 7,000 Americans surrendered. It was the second largest mass surrender in U.S. military history. Among them was Captain Robert Chen, 26 years old, from San Francisco. With him were 42 of his men, including Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski and a 19-year-old farm boy from Ohio named Danny Morrison. The Germans marched them east. No food, no water. Boots disintegrating in the snow. Men collapsed and were shot where they fell. By the time they reached the Czech border, half the column was dead. And then, instead of being sent to a registered POW camp where the Red Cross could find them, Chen's group of 43 was diverted. Dumped at a small farm in southern Germany, locked in a barn. Forgotten. The Wehrmacht left orders with the farmer. Keep them alive. Barely. Then the Wehrmacht left and never came back. The war moved west. The Germans started losing everywhere, and those 43 men disappeared from every record, every list, every report. Their families back in America were told they were missing in action, presumed dead. 43 telegrams. 43 gold star flags hung in windows. But all they really needed was one farmer to open a door. He never did. His name was Otto Brandt, 60 years old, born in 1885, a widower. 2 sons in the Wehrmacht, both killed on the Eastern Front. He was not a Nazi party member. He was not a soldier. He was just a farmer, a man who tilled his fields and raised his pigs and went to church on Sunday. Neighbors said he was quiet, hard-working, polite, the kind of man who tipped his hat to women in the village, the kind of man no one would ever suspect of cruelty. But underneath that ordinary skin was something colder. When his sons died at Stalingrad, something inside Otto Brandt froze solid. He blamed the Americans. He blamed the British. He blamed every Allied bomber that dropped its payload on German cities. And when the Wehrmacht knocked on his door in late December 1944 and said, "We have 43 Amerikaner for you to hold," Brandt did not hesitate. He nodded. He took the key. He walked his prisoners into his barn at gunpoint. He locked the door. And that night, he ate dinner. Roast pork, bread with butter, a glass of schnapps. 20 meters away, 43 men shivered in the December cold. No blankets, no food, packed onto a dirt floor covered in old straw. Brandt slept well that night. He would sleep well for the next 120 nights. while inside his barn, men began to die in slow motion. The conditions inside that barn were a calculated horror. The men were given 1 bucket of water per day for all 43 of them, 1 loaf of stale bread twice a week. Sometimes Brant would forget for 2 or 3 days. Sometimes he simply did not feel like walking out. There was no toilet, no latrine. The men used one corner of the barn, and that corner grew until it spread across half the floor. There was no heat. German winter dropped to -15 Celsius. The men huddled together for warmth, the strongest on the outside, the weakest in the middle. Captain Chen organized everything. He rationed the water by the cap of a canteen. He created shifts so men could sleep against each other. He led prayers. He told stories about home, about Brooklyn and Iowa and Texas, anything to keep their minds alive. But men died anyway, not many. Brant gave just enough to keep most breathing. But 3 men perished in those first 8 weeks. Pneumonia, dysentery, a simple cut that turned septic. Their bodies were dragged out by the German guards in January and buried somewhere in the woods. Chen never knew where. Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski tried to escape in the first week. He picked the lock with a piece of wire from a feed sack. 3 men slipped out into the snow. They got 100 meters before the dogs found them. The Germans dragged Kowalski back, threw him on the floor of the barn in front of all 43 men, and beat him with rifle butts for 20 minutes. They broke his ribs, shattered his hip, cracked his jaw. The men heard every bone snap. After that, no one tried again. They simply waited. They counted days by scratching marks on the wooden walls. 100. 110. 120. By April 1945, when Patton's Third Army was racing east through Bavaria, those scratches covered 3 entire walls of the barn, and Captain Chen had stopped believing anyone was coming. Then came April 24th, 1945. A clear, cold morning. Sergeant Tom Riley's scout patrol was sweeping a sector ahead of Patton's main column. Standard procedure: check farms, confirm no enemy holdouts, move on. Riley was 28 from Brooklyn, a former dock worker who had been fighting since Omaha Beach. He had seen Aachen. He had seen Bastogne. He thought nothing could surprise him anymore. He was wrong. He smelled it before he saw it. Not death exactly. Something worse. Something living that should not be alive. He followed the smell across a field past a tidy farmhouse, with smoke curling from its chimney to a large wooden barn at the edge of the property. The doors were padlocked from the outside. He listened. Movement inside. A wet, rattling cough. And then a voice weak as a whisper, but unmistakably American. "Is someone out there?" Riley's heart stopped. He shouted back, "This is the U.S. Army. Who is in there?" Silence. Then the voice again, breaking with disbelief. "Americans. We're Americans. Prisoners. Please, please, get us out." Riley did not wait for orders. He did not call for backup. He raised his M1. Garand aimed at the heavy iron padlock and fired. The bullet sheared the lock clean off. The doors swung open, and the war stopped just for a moment in that one corner of Germany. The men who came crawling out into the April sunlight did not look like soldiers anymore. They looked like ghosts who had forgotten how to be human. Captain Chen was the first one to reach the door. He tried to stand. He could not. His legs simply folded. Riley caught him before he hit the ground, and Chen weighed almost nothing in his arms. 74 pounds. A grown man. The skin on his face was stretched tight over his skull. His eyes were unfocused, struggling against the daylight. Chen looked up at Riley and tried to speak. His voice came out as a rasp. "Captain Robert Chen, 106th Infantry Division, requesting medical assistance. For my men." Then he started to cry, and he could not stop. Behind Chen, men poured out of the barn in slow motion, some on their feet swaying, some on their hands and knees. Private Danny Morrison, the Ohio farm boy, came out crawling, his eyes squeezed shut against the sun. When he tried to open them, he could not see. 4 months of total darkness had damaged his retinas. He kept blinking. He kept whispering, "Why can't I see? Why can't I see?" Master Sergeant Kowalski limped out last, dragging his shattered hip behind him like a broken wing. Riley got on the radio. His voice was shaking something it had not done in 2 years of combat. "Command, this is Scout 7. We have 43 American POWs. Locked in a barn. Condition critical. Repeat, 43 Americans. Need medical evac immediately." The radio crackled back. "Scout 7, secure the location. General Patton is en route. ETA 2 hours. Riley turned and looked at the farmhouse. Otto Brandt was still standing in the doorway, watching. Calm, unmoved. His clothes were clean. His face was full. His belly was round under his sweater. 20 meters away, Americans were dying in his barn, and he had been eating roast pork. Riley felt something rise inside him that he had never felt before in the entire war. Not rage, something colder. He started walking toward the farmhouse. His men loaded the prisoners onto blankets, gave them water in tiny sips because too much water at once would kill them. The medics had not arrived yet. There was no morphine. There was no IV. There was only Riley walking across a frozen yard toward a man whose face he was about to memorize for the rest of his life. And in the distance, a column of dust rising on the eastern road. Patton was coming. And in 2 hours, Otto Brandt's barn would have a new occupant. The question was no longer whether justice would be served. The question was how. And what Patton was about to do would split his own officers down the middle, divide his army, and become a story whispered for decades inside the U.S. Third Army, a story they were not allowed to tell. In Part 2, you will see the moment Patton stepped inside that barn, the 30 seconds of silence that followed, and the order he gave Otto Brandt that no general in any army had ever given before. April 24th, 1945. Sergeant Tom Riley had just blown the padlock off a German barn and discovered 43 skeletal American POWs locked inside for 120 days. Master Sergeant Kowalski with a shattered hip. Captain Chen at 74 pounds. Private Morrison blind from 4 months of total darkness. And 20 meters away, the German farmer Otto Brandt stood on his porch in clean clothes, well-fed, watching it all with the calm of a man who had done nothing wrong. Riley was already walking toward him, but on the eastern road a column of dust was rising fast. 3 jeeps, 4 stars. General George S. Patton himself was 2 hours out, and what he was about to do would split his own command staff in half. Because the Geneva Convention had rules. The U.S. Army had rules. And what Patton was about to order Otto Brandt to do violated every one of them. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next gripping story. Join us as we uncover more legendary moments, hidden truths, and unforgettable heroes from the darkest chapters of history. And this is where everything got worse. The first medical truck arrived 40 minutes after Riley's radio call. Captain Walter Briggs jumped out, the senior medical officer attached to the Third Army's forward element. He took one look at the men coming out of that barn, and his face went white. Then he turned to Riley with a question that would define the next 48 hours. "Sergeant, where is the man responsible?" Riley pointed at the farmhouse. Otto Brandt was still standing there. Briggs walked over to him slowly, professionally, and asked in broken German for his identification papers. Brandt handed them over. Briggs studied them. Then he handed them back and said, "You are under arrest pending trial for war crimes." Brandt did not move. He simply replied in careful English, "I followed Wehrmacht orders. I am a civilian. I have rights under your laws." And that is when the trouble started. Because Otto Brandt was correct. Under U.S. Army Field Manual 2710, the rules of land warfare, civilian prisoners had to be processed through proper military government channels. They had to be charged. They had to be given counsel. They had to be tried by tribunal. They could not be punished on the spot by any officer, no matter how senior. Captain Briggs knew this. Every officer in the Third Army knew this. And when Patton's jeep finally rolled into that farmyard at 14:30 hours, Briggs was the first man to reach him. "Sir, a word before you go to the barn." Patton stepped down from the jeep. "Make it quick, Captain." The general walked to the barn first anyway, with Briggs trailing behind him. Patton stepped inside alone. He stood in the dim light for 30 full seconds. He saw the scratch marks on the walls, the dirty straw, the corner where men had been forced to relieve themselves for 120 days. He saw a child's name carved into one beam, scratched by Private Morrison, who had wanted something of himself to survive if he did not. Patton walked back out. His face was the color of stone. Briggs spoke fast. "Sir, the farmer claims civilian status. Under our regulations, he must be transferred to military government for trial. We cannot detain him here. We cannot punish him here. We don't have the authority." Patton turned to him slowly. "Captain, are you telling me what authority I have in my army?" Briggs did not flinch. "Yes, sir, I am. Because if you do what I think you are about to do, the Inspector General will have your stars. The press will crucify us, and those 43 men deserve their justice the right way." Patton stared at Briggs for a long moment. Officers around them held their breath. And then Patton said something nobody expected. "You may be right, Captain. You may be right." He walked away. He walked toward the medical trucks. He looked like a man who had just lost an argument with himself. But Captain Briggs was not the only officer on that farm. There was a younger man with him, a lieutenant colonel named Henry Vasquez, the Third Army's deputy provost marshal in charge of military police and detention. Vasquez had been listening to the entire exchange, and Vasquez was not Briggs. Vasquez was a former district attorney from El Paso, Texas, 38 years old, who had personally prosecuted 17 murder cases before the war. He understood the law better than any officer in the farmyard. He also understood something else. He understood loopholes. Vasquez approached Patton near the medical trucks where Captain Chen was being loaded onto a stretcher. "General, a word." Patton turned. Vasquez spoke quietly. "Sir, Captain Briggs is correct that we cannot punish Brandt. But there is a different mechanism in the rules of land warfare. Article 43 of the Hague Convention. Occupied territory. The occupying commander has the authority to detain any civilian who poses an immediate security threat pending investigation. There is no time limit specified. There is no condition specified about where that detention takes place." Patton's eyes narrowed. "Go on, Colonel." Vasquez continued. "Sir, Otto Brandt's barn is at this moment a confirmed crime scene. It is also by definition a secure detention facility. He used it as one for 120 days. We have full legal authority to detain him at the crime scene during our investigation. The investigation can take as long as we judge necessary. And during that detention, we are required to provide him only with what the previous occupants received. The same rations, the same conditions. Anything more would be preferential treatment." Patton stared at him. "Colonel, are you telling me there is a legal way to lock that man in his own barn?" Vasquez nodded once. "Yes, sir. As long as we keep it under 1 week, document everything, and transfer him to formal trial afterward, no court will overturn it. The precedent exists. I will sign the detention order myself." Patton stood very still. He looked at the barn. He looked at Brandt. He looked at Captain Chen on the stretcher, the man who had asked Patton minutes earlier whether 1 week was mercy enough or whether it would make them like the enemy. And Patton said, "Write the order, Colonel. Write it now." The detention order was drafted on the hood of a Jeep at 15:10 hours on April 24, 1945. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Vasquez wrote in a careful hand citing the Hague Convention of 1907, Article 43 and Field Manual 27-10, Section 247, Paragraph C. The subject, Otto Brandt, was to be detained at the crime scene for a period not to exceed 7 days, during which a formal investigation would be conducted into his treatment of 43 United States Army personnel. During detention, The subject would receive rations equivalent to those provided to the prisoners during their captivity, as documented by witness testimony. 1 bucket of water per 24 hours. 1 loaf of bread every 3 days. Witnesses signed it. Captain Briggs signed it last reluctantly after reading the legal citations 3 times. He could not find a flaw. The order was technically narrowly defensibly legal. Patton himself walked over to Otto Brandt at 15:30 hours. 2 MPs flanked him. Patton spoke through an interpreter, but Brandt understood English perfectly well. Otto Brandt, you are detained pending investigation of war crimes. Your detention will take place at the crime scene. You will receive the same rations you provided your prisoners. The duration will not exceed 7 days. After that, you will be transferred to formal tribunal. Brandt's face went white, then red. He started shouting in German. The interpreter translated. He says this is barbaric. He says he is 60 years old. He says he will die. He says you are no better than the SS. Patton listened. Then he leaned in close to Brandt's face and said one sentence that the interpreter did not need to translate. My men were 19, some were younger. They survived because they had each other. You will have only yourself. Now we will find out what kind of man you really are. The MPs grabbed Brandt's arms. He fought, he kicked, he bit one of them. They dragged him across the yard while the medics watched in silence. They dragged him into the barn. They threw him onto the dirty straw, into the corner that smelled of 120 days of human waste. Then they swung the heavy doors closed. The padlock clicked. The bolt slid home. And Otto Brandt, 60 years old, well-fed, clean, was alone in the dark for the first time in his life. 43 men had walked out. 1 man had walked in. And from inside the barn, the medics on the stretchers heard him start to scream. Not in pain, in terror. Because Otto Brandt had just realized for the first time in 4 months what it actually felt like to be locked inside that place. The men loading onto the trucks heard him screaming for 10 full minutes. Captain Chen, on his stretcher, listened in silence. Master Sergeant Kowalski, the man whose hip had been shattered with rifle butts, listened too. He turned his head slowly toward Patton. He whispered, in a voice that had not held this much strength in 4 months. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Patton nodded once. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply walked back to his jeep. The trucks rolled out at 16:05 hours, carrying 43 men toward the field hospital at Regensburg. Behind them, Otto Brandt was still screaming. But what Patton did not know, what nobody on that farm knew yet, was that word was already spreading. A war correspondent named James Holloway from the Associated Press had been with the medical column. He had photographed the barn. He had photographed the men. He had photographed Otto Brandt being dragged through the doorway. His film was already on its way back to a darkroom in Frankfurt. And in Frankfurt, the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force had a press office. And that press office was about to receive photographs that would land on the desk of General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself within 72 hours. Eisenhower had strict rules about prisoner treatment. Eisenhower had political concerns about how the Allies appeared to the world in the final weeks of the war. Eisenhower was already managing accusations from the Soviets about American conduct in newly liberated zones. And Eisenhower was about to see photographs of a 60-year-old German civilian being thrown into a barn by U.S. military police on the personal order of George S. Patton. Patton, who had already been disciplined twice for insubordination. Patton, who had been removed from command once before for slapping a soldier. Patton, who Eisenhower had warned in writing, no more incidents. By April 27th, those photographs would be in Frankfurt. By April 28th, they would be on Eisenhower's desk, and Eisenhower would be forced to make a decision that could end Patton's career, free Otto Brandt, and turn 43 liberated American POWs into a political scandal that the Soviets would weaponize for the next 10 years. Captain Chen did not know it yet, lying on his stretcher dreaming of San Francisco. Sergeant Riley did not know it. Patton himself did not know it. But while Otto Brandt screamed in his barn, a different war was about to begin. A war fought in offices, in press rooms. in cables flying between Frankfurt and Washington. A war over whether the man who had liberated 43 Americans would be allowed to keep his stars. In Part 3, you will see the moment Eisenhower opened the envelope, the cable he sent to Patton, and the desperate 24-hour race that followed as 43 liberated POWs in a hospital bed prepared to do something for their general that no enlisted men had ever done before. Because the real fight for justice was just beginning, and this time the enemy wore an American uniform. April 24, 1945. Patton had thrown Otto Brandt into the same barn where 43 Americans had been starved for 120 days. Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez had found a legal loophole. The detention order was signed. The padlock was closed. But a war correspondent named James Holloway had already photographed everything, and his film was racing toward Frankfurt, where General Eisenhower would see it within 72 hours. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next gripping story. Join us as we uncover more legendary moments, hidden truths, and unforgettable heroes from the darkest chapters of history. And by April 27, 1945, the political shockwave that hit Allied headquarters in Frankfurt would dwarf anything Patton had ever survived before. Because what nobody yet realized was that Otto Brandt's barn was about to become the single most photographed crime scene of the entire European war. And now, this was no longer a quiet liberation. The film reached Frankfurt at 0900 hours on April 26, 1945. The Associated Press developed it overnight. By midnight, prints were on a courier flight to London. By April 27th at 700 hours, the photographs landed on the desk of Brigadier General Frank Allen, head of SHAEF Public Relations. Allen took one look and called Eisenhower's office directly. Eisenhower was in a planning meeting about the final push toward Berlin. He stepped out, took the folder, and laid the photographs across his desk in silence. There were 11 of them. The barn from outside padlock blown off. Captain Chen on a stretcher weighing 74 pounds ribs visible through his shirt. Private Morrison being led blind across the yard. Master Sergeant Kowalski's shattered hip. The corner of the barn floor used as a latrine for 120 days. And then the photograph that made Eisenhower's jaw tighten. Otto Brandt being dragged through the barn door by 2 American MPs, while George S. Patton stood 5 feet away watching with his arms crossed. Eisenhower stared at it for 30 seconds. Then he said one sentence to his aide. "Get me Patton on the line. Now." Because Eisenhower understood instantly what every other man in the room understood. The Soviets were going to see these photographs. The Soviets were already accusing American forces of mistreating German civilians in occupied zones. Stalin's propaganda machine had been waiting 6 months for exactly this kind of ammunition. Within 48 hours, Pravda could have these images on its front page with the headline, "American General Tortures Elderly German." And the world would not see Otto Brandt, the war criminal. The world would see a 60-year-old man dragged into a barn by an army that called itself Liberators. The cable Eisenhower sent to Patton at 0815 hours read in part, "Release the German civilian immediately. Transfer to military government for processing. Explain your actions in person at my headquarters within 48 hours. Patton received the cable at 10:30 hours. He read it twice, then he crumpled it in his fist. But this was not the only blow coming. At Regensburg Field Hospital, Captain Robert Chen was being fed glucose through an IV drip. He had gained 4 pounds in 72 hours. His feet were still swaddled in bandages, and the surgeons had told him he would lose 2 toes on his left foot. But Chen was awake, and Chen was reading newspapers. The first thing he saw in a copy of Stars and Stripes flown in from London was a small article on page 3. War Crimes Protocol questioned. The Inspector General's office was reportedly opening a preliminary inquiry into the conduct of the Third Army at an undisclosed location in southern Germany. Chen understood instantly. He turned to Master Sergeant Kowalski in the next bed. "Frank, they are going to court-martial Patton for what he did." Kowalski tried to sit up. Failed. "Sir, that cannot happen." Chen's voice was hoarse. "It is happening. Right now. And meanwhile, Otto Brandt had been in the barn for 60 hours. He had refused to drink the water on the first day. He had thrown the bread against the wall on the second day. By hour 60, he was screaming through the cracks in the door at any American soldier who walked past. He demanded a lawyer. He demanded a doctor. He demanded the Red Cross. The MPs guarding the barn reported that Brandt was deteriorating faster than any of them had expected. He was 60 years old. He had no military discipline. He had spent his entire adult life eating 3 meals a day and sleeping in a warm bed. The reality of what he had done to 43 young men was hitting his body in ways it had never hit theirs, because they had been 20 and they had been soldiers. Otto Brandt was just a farmer. And on the morning of April 27th, the MPs found him collapsed against the inside of the barn door, dehydrated, shivering, weeping. The investigating officers were forced to reduce the original sentence on medical grounds. Brandt was pulled out after only 72 hours, not the 7 days originally ordered. He was transferred to a military hospital under guard. The case against him was preserved. But Patton's discipline of him was effectively over, and Eisenhower's cable demanded he answer for it within 48 hours. Patton flew to Frankfurt on the morning of April 28, 1945. He landed at Rhine-Main Airfield at 0840 hours. He drove directly to SHAEF headquarters in the IG Farben building, the massive concrete fortress Eisenhower had taken as his command post. Patton walked into Eisenhower's office at 0930 hours. He saluted. He stood at attention. Eisenhower did not return the salute immediately. The two generals stared at each other across a desk covered in photographs. "Sit down, George." Patton sat. Eisenhower slid the photographs across the desk. "Explain these." Patton looked at them. Then he looked at Eisenhower. "Sir, 43 American soldiers were locked in that barn for 120 days. 3 of them died in there. Their bodies are still missing." The man responsible was sitting in his warm farmhouse, well-fed 20 meters away the entire time. He was not a soldier. He was not following orders. The Wehrmacht had abandoned that area in February. He kept those men locked in his barn for the last 8 weeks entirely on his own initiative. Eisenhower listened. Then he asked the question that mattered. "Why did you not transfer him to military government, George? Why did you put him in that barn yourself?" Patton was silent for 10 seconds. Then he answered, "Because I wanted Captain Chen to see it. I wanted Sergeant Kowalski, whose hip is now shattered for life, to see it. I wanted Private Morrison, who is going home blind, to see it. I wanted those 43 men to know that justice was real, that somebody had answered for what was done to them. Not in a courtroom in Nuremberg 18 months from now. Now. Today." Eisenhower leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes. For a full minute, neither man spoke. Then Eisenhower opened his eyes and said, "George, you are the most insubordinate son of a bitch in this army. And you are also the most goddamn effective. Get out of my office." Patton stood up. He saluted. Eisenhower returned the salute this time. The court-martial paperwork that had been drafted by SHAEF lawyers the day before was quietly placed in a desk drawer. It was never filed. It was never destroyed either. It sits in the Eisenhower Archives at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, to this day. A document signed, but never executed. Because Eisenhower understood something about the politics of liberation that the lawyers had missed, the photographs Eisenhower had feared so much went the other way. The Associated Press released them on April 30th, 1945. They ran on the front page of every major American newspaper: the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post. The headlines were not what SHAEF had feared. They were headlines like "American POWs found alive after 4 months in German barn," and "Patton liberates 43 from secret holding site," and "The face of Nazi civilian cruelty exposed." Captain Chen's photograph, 74 pounds alive, became one of the most reprinted images of the entire European theater. Within 72 hours, the American public knew his name. Within a week, Chen was receiving letters from total strangers across the country. Mothers of MYAs writing to ask if he had seen their sons. Pastors writing to tell him their congregations were praying for him. Children writing in pencil asking if he was a hero. The political danger Eisenhower had feared never materialized. The Soviets did try. Pravda ran a small piece on May 4th, attempting to portray Brandt as a victim of American excess, but it gained no traction. The American photographs were too powerful. The skeletons too visible. The barn too damning. The casualty figures from the Battle of the Bulge were also released that same week, May 1945. Total American casualties from December 1944 to January 1945. 89,000. Killed, wounded, captured. Of the captured, an estimated 23,000 remained unaccounted for at the start of April 1945. By the end of May, after Patton's farm, photographs ran in every paper. Similar discoveries were made across Germany. Smaller groups, individual soldiers, civilian-held POWs in basements, barns-locked rooms. The total identified by July 1945 was 1,100. Additional liberated American POWs from civilian holding sites. Most of them were liberated only because units were now searching for them. Searching specifically. Patton's barn had taught the entire U.S. Army what to look for. By the end of 1945, the Nuremberg tribunals had begun. Otto Brandt was tried in March 1946 by a U.S. military commission at Dachau. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was 12 years hard labor. He served 8 before being released in 1954 on health grounds. He died in 1961 alone in a small apartment in Munich. None of his neighbors knew his story. His grave is unmarked. But what happened to the man who ordered him locked in that barn? What happened to George S. Patton, who had defied Eisenhower, defied the Geneva Convention, defied the Inspector General, and yet emerged from it, not court-martialed, but quietly vindicated? In December 1945, Patton would be dead. Not in combat, not in glory. Dead in a circumstance so strange, so suspicious, that historians would argue about it for the next 80 years. And on his deathbed in Heidelberg, the last visitor he received was a man in a wheelchair with bandaged feet. A man named Captain Robert Chen. And what Chen brought him, what Chen said to him, and what Patton whispered back in his final hours is the story most history books have never told. In Part 4, you will see the final chapter. The mysterious accident, the deathbed visit, the fates of all 43 liberated men over the next 50 years. And the one secret about that barn, about Otto Brandt, about the entire affair that did not come out until a German archive was opened in 2003. Because this story has one more chapter, and it is the chapter almost no one knows. April 1945. 43 American POWs locked in a German barn for 120 days. Patton's defiance. Eisenhower's cable. Otto Brandt thrown into his own barn. The photographs that almost ended Patton's career, and instead exposed Nazi civilian cruelty to the entire world. Captain Chen alive at 74 pounds. Master Sergeant Kowalski with a shattered hip. Private Morrison going home blind. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next gripping story. Join us as we uncover more legendary moments, hidden truths, and unforgettable heroes from the darkest chapters of history. But the story of that barn was not over. Because there was a final chapter no one expected. A car accident. A deathbed visit in Heidelberg. And a German archive that did not open until 2003, revealing a truth about Otto Brandt's farm that would have changed everything if anyone had known it in 1945. Because sometimes justice arrives late, and sometimes the cost is paid by the men who delivered it. George S. Patton never made it home. On December 9, 1945, 7 months after liberating that barn, Patton was riding in a Cadillac staff car on a country road outside Mannheim, Germany. He was on his way to a pheasant hunt. The car was hit by a U.S. Army truck at low speed. Patton broke his neck. He was paralyzed from the chest down. He was conscious. He was lucid. He was rushed to the U.S. Army hospital at Heidelberg, where he lay in traction for 12 days, fully aware that he was dying. The official cause of death on December 21, 1945, was a pulmonary embolism. He was 60 years old, the same age as Otto Brandt. And on December 18th, 3 days before he died, a young man in a wheelchair was rolled into Patton's hospital room. Captain Robert Chen. He had gained back 40 pounds. He could walk on crutches. He had been recovering at a U.S. Army facility in Frankfurt and had asked for permission to travel the 70 kilometers to Heidelberg as soon as he heard about the accident. The nurse on duty, Lieutenant Margaret Whitaker, was the only witness to what happened next. She wrote about it in a letter to her sister in 1948, a letter that surfaced in a Pennsylvania estate sale in 1991. Chen rolled himself to Patton's bedside. He could not salute, his arm was still in a sling. So he simply said, "Sir, I came to thank you." Patton could barely turn his head. He whispered, "You owe me nothing, Captain." Chen shook his head. He pulled out a small object from his coat pocket. It was a piece of wood splintered dark with age. He laid it on Patton's chest. "Sir, this is from the door of that barn. I went back. I cut it myself. I wanted you to have it." Patton closed his eyes. A tear ran down his temple into his pillow. He whispered something Chen had to lean in to hear. "Tell them, Captain. Tell them what we found. Don't let it be forgotten." Chen nodded. He stayed for 40 more minutes. Patton drifted in and out. When Chen finally left, the piece of wood remained on Patton's chest. It was buried with him. It is in his coffin to this day beneath a marble cross at the American Military Cemetery in Hamm, Luxembourg. The 43 liberated men scattered across America. Captain Robert Chen returned to San Francisco, finished his medical degree, and became a trauma surgeon at San Francisco General Hospital. He worked for 37 years. He never spoke publicly about the barn. He kept a single photograph in his office, the famous Associated Press image of himself on the stretcher. When patients asked about it, he would only say, "That was a long time ago." He died in 1994 at the age of 75, peacefully surrounded by his 3 children and 7 grandchildren. Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski went home to Detroit and worked as a foreman at the Ford River Rouge plant. His shattered hip never healed properly. He used a cane for the rest of his life. He died in 1962, at 52 years old, of complications from his old injuries. His wife Helen kept his Bronze Star and his Prisoner of War medal in a small wooden box beside their bed until her own death in 1989. Private Danny Morrison, the 19-year-old farm boy from Ohio, never regained full sight. He went home to his family's farm outside Dayton. His mother and father had been told he was missing in action and presumed dead. When he stepped off the train, his mother fainted on the platform. Danny worked the family farm for the rest of his life. He learned to plow by feel by the angle of the sun on his face, by the sound of his horses. He married a local school teacher named Eleanor in 1948. They had 4 children. Danny Morrison died in 2008 at the age of 82. He was the last of the 43 to pass away. He never visited Germany again. The remaining 40 soldiers lived varying lengths. Most returned to ordinary American lives, factory jobs, small businesses, families. 3 of them committed suicide within 10 years of returning home, casualties of what would later be called PTSD, but in 1945 had no name. Their families never received any acknowledgement of why. The discovery of Brandt's barn changed how the U.S. Army searched for missing prisoners forever. By June 1945, every advancing American unit in Germany was issued specific instructions to search civilian properties for unreported POW holding sites. By the end of 1945, the U.S. Army had liberated 730 additional American POWs from civilian-held sites across Germany and Austria, men who would otherwise have died forgotten. The protocol developed from Brandt's barn became standard procedure. It was used in the Korean War to search for prisoners held by Chinese sympathizers behind the lines. It was used in Vietnam to identify South Vietnamese collaborators holding American flyers. It is still used today by U.S. Special Operations Command in hostage recovery operations across the Middle East and Africa. The legal precedent set by Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez, the El Paso prosecutor who found the loophole that allowed Patton to detain Brandt at the crime scene, became the foundation of modern occupation law. Vasquez himself returned to Texas after the war and was elected district attorney of El Paso County in 1948. He served 3 terms. He never spoke publicly about his role in the Brandt detention. He died in 1981. Sergeant Tom Riley, the Brooklyn dock worker who shot off the padlock, returned to New York and worked the docks for another 26 years. He raised 4 children in a small apartment in Bay Ridge. He kept the spent cartridge from that bullet, the one that broke the lock, in a mason jar on his mantelpiece for the rest of his life. When his grandson asked him in 1978 what it was, Riley said, "Only the best shot I ever fired." He died in 1991. The cartridge is now in the collection of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. What does this story teach us about evil? About justice? About the fine line between the two? Otto Brandt was not a soldier. He was not a Nazi party member. He was not a fanatic. He was an ordinary man who chose day after day for 120 days to step over a line most of us will never even approach. He ate his roast pork while men starved 20 meters away. He slept warm while men froze. The horror of him was not in his uniform. It was in his ordinariness. And the lesson Patton understood when he locked Brandt in that barn was that ordinary cruelty must be answered with extraordinary clarity. Not with policies, not with paperwork. With consequences a 60-year-old farmer could feel in his own bones. There is a moral debate that still divides scholars today. Did Patton break the law that day? Technically, yes. Did Patton serve justice that day in the eyes of 43 men who had been left to die? Absolutely. The two answers do not cancel each other. They sit side by side uncomfortably, the way most truths in war do. World War II is full of moments like this. The decision to firebomb Dresden. The decision to drop the atomic bombs. The decision to ignore the death camps until they were already liberated. History does not give clean answers. It gives only the men who acted and the consequences of their actions, and the long, quiet years afterward in which the rest of us must decide what we believe. In 2003, the German Federal Archives in Koblenz released a previously classified file recovered from Wehrmacht Regional Command in Bavaria. The file contained the original December 1944 order assigning 43 American POWs to civilian holding at the Brandt farm. And the order contained one detail no one had ever known. It was not the Wehrmacht who chose Otto Brandt's farm at random. Otto Brandt had volunteered. In November 1944, Brandt had written a letter to his local Wehrmacht garrison commander offering his property as a holding site for any American or British prisoners. The letter preserved in the file contained a single sentence that explained everything. "Major, my 2 sons died at Stalingrad. I would like the opportunity to make Americans pay." The Wehrmacht had not forced Otto Brandt to do anything. He had asked for those men. He had hunted that opportunity. When Patton asked him in April 1945 why he had kept Americans locked in a barn, and Brandt said, "I followed orders," he was lying. There were no orders. There was only Otto Brandt, a grieving father, choosing revenge against 43 young men who had never met his sons. The file is now in the German Federal Archives, Koblenz Collection, RH49-7-1944. Anyone can read it. Almost no one ever does. From a Brooklyn dock worker who smelled something wrong outside a barn, to a Texas prosecutor who found a loophole in occupation law, to a 60-year-old general who refused to wait for justice. From 43 skeletons in the dark to 730 more men found alive across Germany because of what they learned that day. From one farmer's lie to a German archive that finally told the truth 58 years later. Otto Brandt died alone in 1961. He never spoke about Stalingrad. He never spoke about his sons. And he never explained to anyone why he had volunteered his barn. The 43 men he tried to break all came home. Most lived long lives. Most never spoke of the barn either. They simply went on. They worked. They raised children. They mowed lawns and went to church and grew old in towns where no one knew what they had survived. That, in the end, is the quiet revenge of every man who outlives the cruelty of another. To live ordinarily, gratefully, fully. To use the years he tried to take from you. If you know a story like this, a story of ordinary courage in extraordinary times, share it in the comments below. This is one of hundreds we are telling. Subscribe to walk with us through the forgotten corners of World War II. Because in the end, evil is loud and justice is loud, but survival is the quietest thing of all. And it is the only thing that lasts.